Hello, and welcome to this launch event for the book, The United States versus China, The Quest for Global Economic Leadership. I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics, and we're going to have a conversation about this new book by Fred Bergsten now for the next hour with some pretty eminent voices and contributors to this debate. Of course, Fred Bergsten, as Martin Wolf referred to him recently, is a doyen of American thinkers on international economic policy, the senior fellow and founding director, emeritus now, of the Peterson Institute, who also served many administrations, both inside the NSC and Treasury. He's going to talk a little bit about his book, and then we'll be hearing from the two discussants, also extremely familiar to anyone tuning in. Larry Summers, now professor of Harvard, former secretary of the Treasury and director of the National Economic Council, and Bob Zoellick, now senior counselor at Brunswick and a senior fellow at Harvard, but previously, of course, president of the World Bank, and before that, US trade representative. This topic, I won't say to this audience that it is could not be more timely, because that's said so often and is so boring. And I'm not sure it's even right, because this debate around the US and China and its future economic relationship has somewhat transcended, is no longer just a topic. It's the issue about which pretty much every conversation about the global economy sooner or later turns to. I don't know what the definition of that kind of issue is. It's the all-consuming issue. But we have had multiple contributions to that over the years, and certainly over the last few years, several books. And Fred's book, I think, is firmly on one side of the debate, but I'll let you hear more of that from the man himself. Fred, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's great to do this at our Peterson Institute, and thank you for your moderating the session. The liberal international economic order of the past 75 years is, I think, one of the greatest success stories in human history. The system has obviously had its flaws and its shortcomings, but over that period, we have had the most dramatic increase in per capita incomes in human history, an enormous reduction in world poverty and hunger. We've had better distribution of global income than ever before. And the economic system has supported the long peace among great powers that has been unprecedented in recent centuries in terms of security. All this was fostered by the global economic system. And China was, of course, the perhaps greatest beneficiary, having recorded a development miracle unprecedented in the annals of development stories. But the United States also gained enormously. Studies that my colleagues at the Institute have done show that the US is now $2 trillion per year richer as a result of the opening of the global economy over the last 75 years. So it's been a huge gain for everybody. The rules, norms, and institutions of that global economic system were, of course, created to avoid the disasters that happened in the previous 30 years. 2 world wars, a recession, a global depression, all of which promoted and maybe caused, on some analyses, by the failures of the global economy, the failure of countries to cooperate, the failures to work together in a global economic system. The post-war system succeeded in large part due to the leadership of the United States, with, of course, strong support from its major allies. That was in sharp contrast to what happened in the 1930s, when the incumbent leader, Great Britain, was no longer able to keep the world out of spiraling depression. The newcomer, the rising power of the United States, was unwilling to step in and take a lead. And in fact, for quite a while, as Bob Zoellick's recent book shows, made it worse. So the idea post-war was to avoid replicating that disaster. And indeed, it has been a huge success. But the global economic system has, in my view, and I lay this out in the book, has, in my view, been eroding, some would say dissolving, over the last 20 to 25 years. In fact, since Larry was at the Treasury, my reading is that the system has been going downhill, in large part because of a decline in the willingness of the United States, not so much the capability, but the willingness of the United States to provide the needed leadership. And the system, I would submit, is now at serious risk unless that can be reversed. The U.S. will to lead declined for several reasons. The end of the Cold War took away the traditional foreign policy case for shoring everybody up through economic cooperation. The backlash against globalization politically within the United States eroded the traditional domestic political support for U.S. global economic leadership. And those two things together culminated in the Trump abdication, literally, Trump abdication of U.S. global economic leadership, leaving a vacuum that has not yet been filled. President Biden, though much more polite and less confrontational and bombastic, has nevertheless not changed the policies very much in this domain. And so we're left with a situation where the traditional U.S. leadership has declined over a substantial period of time, leaving something of a leadership vacuum in the crucial global economy. Now, into that situation comes the rise of China. China is not looking so great this week with its latest COVID outbreak and supply chains being disrupted and lower growth numbers and its Russian ally becoming a pariah. But the fact is, China, of course, has had the most dramatic development success in world history. It has now reached rough equivalence with the United States in terms of global economic power. Its GDP in purchasing power terms is bigger than that of the US, and in market exchange rate terms will be bigger in the next few years. It's, of course, the biggest trading country. It's got by far the biggest foreign exchange reserves. Its growth will undoubtedly, even at these lower rates, its growth will undoubtedly be at least twice or three times that of the United States and its allies going forward. So China's role will continue to grow. China, in other words, represents the first real challenge to American economic supremacy in the 100+ years since the US became the world's chief economy around the end of the First World War. That raises an additional question of whether the US can retain its global economic leadership, which has always rested on US economic supremacy, but that is now challenged. That is now equated by that of China. And it raises the question, what can replace the traditional US role, or can anything be found that would replace it? In short, we've got the classic problem of a rising power, China, facing an incumbent power, the United States. Both are behaving in traditional form, the US resisting any encroachments on its leadership, China trying to edge its way in wherever it can and citing its goals to move forward. So you've got the foundation for a new Cold War between the United States and China, and one that could, on some people's readings, get even worse. The China rise also raises a systemic challenge, and that's really the focus of my book. What does this mean for the functioning of the world economy, the international economic order that up till now has been led quite successfully by the United States? China, to be clear at the outset, likes and values greatly the current international economic order. They've benefited enormously from it. They know that. They certainly do not want to destroy or even seriously disrupt the global economic system. However, they do want to increase their role. And in many respects, that's justified. If you look at the International Monetary Fund, China's share is 1/3 that of the United States, whereas the IMF's own formula shows that China should now have an equal share to that of the United States, and over the coming few years should have an even larger share. China is grossly underrepresented. So they want a bigger role, but they also want some changes in the rules and the norms that govern the global economic system. That is important to them. I don't think they're willing to disrupt or certainly destroy the system in order to get that, but they clearly want it. Some of those norms, Chinese characteristics that they would like to embody, would not be so comfortable for the United States and much of the West. It would include more state intervention than market focus, as has been the current system. It would mean less rule of law and more arbitrary decision making. It would certainly mean a greater tilt toward authoritarianism vis-a-vis democracy. So the China challenge raises a lot of big questions for the global economic order, as well as the broader security and political dimensions. Now, Bob Zoellick, when he was in the State Department over 15 years ago, called on China to become a responsible stakeholder in the global economy. A very prescient and I think correct view at the time. And over time, China has shown on a number of occasions very positive global economic leadership, going back to the Asian financial crisis in the late 70s and late 90s, certainly the global financial crisis 12 years ago, more recently, the Paris Agreement on climate change. China has shown an ability and proclivity to exercise positive global economic leadership. However, its policies also have undermined and even jeopardized the global economic order. Early in this century, its massive currency manipulation violated the most fundamental rule of the IMF and the global monetary system, i.e., don't try to export your problems through currency undervaluation. More recently, after it got over that, its theft of intellectual property, its subsidies, its forced technology transfers, all have caused huge trade and investment problems, leading to backlash against it from the rest of the world. And that's where the rubber hits the road. China wants the best of all worlds from the global economy. It wants to benefit from the open system, but at the same time, cheat and get away with deviations from the rules where they think that benefits them. What has now happened is that those deviant Chinese policies have led to big backlash. The trade war with the United States, backlash now from the EU when China attacked Lithuania and therefore attacked the EU. Backlash around the world is jeopardizing the open international economic order on which China itself places such keen interest. And that poses a real policy dilemma for the Chinese, and is one reason why, as you'll see in my remarks, I believe that China can be weaned or persuaded or convinced, primarily through internal debate, but also help from the outside, to take a much more positive, supportive role in the world economic system. But right now, they are directly violating many of its principles and norms, and by inducing other countries to emulate it, like the US with its trade protection and trade war, they're eroding the system indirectly as well as directly. Now, it's also clear that the world economy cannot achieve its major goals without cooperation between the United States and China. These are the two economic superpowers. And when you put them together, they will shortly account for well over half the entire world economy. Europe, the EU, could be a third power, but of course it does not operate as a group on very many issues, and so it doesn't qualify to fit into that construct. So it's the US and China, for better or worse, the two global economic superpowers. And if we're contemplating reforms on climate change or pandemic responses or restoring the trading system, the US and China have got to get together to do it. They can veto, they can block each other's initiatives, so they've really got to get together. We also see they can lead in negative directions, like the trade war. My friend Arvind Subramaniam calls it the G-2 with China and the US leading the world in the wrong direction. So with that construct, China's ascent to equivalence with the US, the need, therefore, to have the two cooperate if global economic order is to be maintained and if new progress is to be achieved, what should be done? A couple of the things are no-brainers from a US standpoint. The US obviously has to put its own house in order, much better, everything ranging from fiscal policy to our voting system, to racial equality, to our broad political dysfunction and polarization. The erosion of all those things has clearly hurt the US image around the world, particularly in China, which views the US as in terminal decline. And so we've simply got to put our own house in order to restore our capability for global economic leadership. A second thing, again, a no-brainer, and fortunately it's being done, is to restore the alliances, which Trump, in the worst of all his follies, blew up. President Biden, fortunately, is trying to put the alliances together. The war with Russia over Ukraine has provided, in that sense, a fortuitous positive thrust. So the alliances are getting back together. But that has not been done yet on the economic front. The US still has protectionist barriers against its chief allies, including the Europeans. It has not been done, certainly, with respect to China, where it's going to be essential for the US and its allies to work together in the directions that I'm talking about to help bring China into a responsible stance of global economic leadership. But it's going to be much harder to forge a strong alliance togetherness vis-a-vis China than it has been toward Russia. China is a lot farther away from Europe. It, of course, has much greater economic ties with the Europeans and others that will give them pause in confronting it, and particularly the Asians who have to live in the neighborhood with China, and where the US is not taking any new economic initiatives to counter the area where China is so strong with those countries. All that makes it much harder for the US and its allies to get together vis-a-vis China than they are doing right now in the war in Ukraine. Now, the final piece of this is, of course, US policy toward China itself. We know what will not work: containment. China's too big, too dynamic. As I've just said, other countries are not about to join a US initiative to contain China. Trump tried it, and it was an abysmal failure. China continued to grow alone among the major countries right through the pandemic. China's share of world trade increased sharply, despite the trade war with the United States. China, as I said, will keep growing 2 to 3 times faster than the United States on almost any rendition. So containment, which a number of people in the US are pursuing, are pushing and seeking, and what some people in China are pushing and seeking, simply will not work, certainly from a US standpoint or from the standpoint of trying to restore an efficient and functioning global economic order. Now, we know that we will continue to disagree with China on some security issues like the South China Sea, on values issues like Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, others. We know there will continue to be disagreement over Taiwan. So my basic strategic proposal for the United States and its allies is to decouple, not the countries, not decouple the US from China in an aggregate sense, but decouple the economic issues from the other issues in the relationship, recognizing that we will continue to disagree on a number of security and political topics, but find a pragmatic way to cooperate with China on economic issues where we do have common interests. We would have to do it with tough conditionality. We would have to insist that China did play by some maybe modified rules. I call my strategy conditional competitive cooperation, to indicate that it would have to be conditional, but it would have to have competitive and cooperative elements. Fortunately, the Biden administration construct, such as it is toward China, very much permits that approach. The Biden people and the president himself, even before he was elected, since he's been president, have said we have two baskets of our relationship with China, a competitive basket and a cooperative basket. They've talked about putting climate change and pandemic responses in the cooperative basket. What I'm suggesting is that the economic issues have to go into that basket as well. Pragmatically deal with those issues while agreeing to disagree on other topics. I think that is the only way we're going to reconcile these different conditions in coming to a new global economic order and leadership thereof. One might say at present, well, what about Ukraine? China is supporting Russia. To that I say, watch what they do, not what they say. China's rhetoric supporting Russia is, of course, despicable, but they have done, as far as I can see, zero by way of tangible support for Russia. And why is that? Importantly, because they do not want to divorce themselves from the global economy. They don't want to bring new sanctions down on them. They want to continue benefiting from the open economic system. And to me, that buttresses the case for trying to find a new modus vivendi with China on economics. Now, all this is going to be difficult to carry out. It will take some time. But in my view, the United States needs both a new vision for its China relationship and, central to the topic I've been discussing today, a restoration of its global economic leadership. The only way it can do that is to work with its allies and with China to find a new leadership or governance structure in which China plays its deserved and greater role. It's a tall order, it's a big task, but I think that effort has to begin now, given the very high stakes that are involved in the issue. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fred. So that's the argument. Bob Zoellick.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. And first, because we all know Fred is still adapting to the modern technological world, I'll hold up the book so people know what to order. I will point out that, at least on the back cover of mine, Larry Summers' quote is first, mine is last. I don't know if this is due to some alphabetical discrimination.
It was clearly an effort to compensate for that I came to you first, Bob.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Great topic and wonderful to be with Fred and Larry and Stephanie. So 5 points. One, to set the context here, Fred Bergsten is the Charles Kimmelberger of his generation. So I hope many, at least on this call, will know Charles Kimmelberger was the leading historian of international economics, crises, and cooperations. And it was in part because he could draw upon his experience with the Marshall Plan. So he was a scholar who understood policymaking and the roles of institutions in international leadership and behavior in international markets. Well, in my view, Fred has been the master of the breakdown of the Marshall Plan, so Bretton Woods order, and how the US has adapted over past decades. Because he understands interconnections among exchange rates, trade, emerging markets, regional integration, debt and development, and importantly, as this book shows, economic power. Fred has a rare ability to craft proposals that push the frontier of policy to address problems. So this is a person who could deal with theory, but also very much with practice. He's been both pragmatic and an innovator. Second, Kindleberger's attention to international economic leadership, of course, drew from his classic study of the Great Depression. And his book on the Great Depression, which I went back and looked at recently, which was published in the mid-70s, considered the possibility of cooperative economic leadership. The theme, of course, grew out of the Great Depression and the idea that Britain had the experience, but no longer the means. The United States had the means, but not the will and experience. And so in the 70s, Kindleberger was playing with this idea of, well, what happens if the world moves to some form of multipolarity? But he was thinking about it in the context of the US and the then EC. So Fred has recalled the Kindleberger trap as a timely basis for examining Sino-American relations, I think a much more complex idea of cooperative leadership. Third, as Fred outlines and as Stephanie mentioned, U.S. hostility towards China has led to a very serious breakdown. And in my view, this is actually quite dangerous. Now, some of this, of course, is Xi's directions and policies and ideology. It certainly contributed. At the same time, without reliving all the history, I'll just suggest if I were in Beijing, I could reasonably conclude after 4 years of Trump and 1 year of Biden that the U.S. cannot accept China's rise, and China has to act accordingly. As Fred mentioned, Russia's war on Ukraine, with China's at least lean toward Putin, has exacerbated this, but particularly for people interested in policy, I think it's created a very short fuse for possible congressional action, which if China just takes one move in the news that seems to be supporting Russia, could be easily lit that fuse. And of course, China now sees itself as the next target for US-led sanctions. Sad to say, and this is where I think Fred's book is a very valuable contribution, I cross the world of security scholars as well as economics. And security scholars seem to have only one model for dealing with an authoritarian power, and it's the Cold War model. This is dearth of intellectual creativity. We've had other authoritarian systems. You could even go back to 1900. So everybody's sort of replaying the Cold War script. And as Fred touched on, but we could talk about more, it doesn't fit well. And moreover, it's unlikely to work with our allies and partners. So fourth, Fred conceptually suggests that international economics might offer a wider range of experience that also could relate to important transnational issues, biological security, climate and carbon, today, energy and food, and a range of economic linkages. And Fred, I think, properly revises some of the mistaken sort of historical revisionism that engagement with China never worked. It worked across the whole series of things, including in the global financial crisis, also on some security issues. But of course, it's imperfect and it's an ongoing effort. But the start is to recognize the true facts here, as opposed to come up with some false view of history. And the point that Fred is focusing on is to at least try to recognize the mutuality of interests, along with deterrence and competition of ideologies and other differences. So the fifth and final point, it's going to be very hard to explore cooperative models if the United States and China perceive a zero-sum world. And that's the way in which some security scholars and some Cold War revisionists or revivalists sort of come back. I find this a little odd. I was part of the Cold War and even sort of its peaceful end. And I've got all these people telling me how the Cold War worked without actually having a good insight of what actually it was. And I think Fred valuably forces readers to recognize costs and risks of the Cold War concept and the likelihood of success. Now, being Fred, he pushes the envelope of ideas about start to rebuild ties. And for now, I'll just say his notion of decoupling economics from the other topics, I think will be challenged about whether some of the decoupling will extend to the economic area as well. Certainly technology, questions of data, right now it's a fight over set of financial markets. But I do want to come back to some foundational points of Fred's book, which I hope can get wide agreement. One, the need for US leadership. Going back to responsible stakeholder, in past years when I was asked about this, at least during the Trump period, I feel that neither the US nor China has been a responsible stakeholder. The need for the leadership to be built upon the foundation at home. Economic history would show unless you're successful at home, your ability to act abroad is going to be limited. And one point that Fred didn't draw out today, but I think is fundamental, the mistake of imitating China. The United States' fundamental strength is its openness as a society to ideas, to trade, to capital, to people. And some of the policies, particularly in the Trump years, but also in the Biden years, seem to think, oh, if we can imitate China by closing ourselves off, we'll compete. That's a fool's competition. You should compete with your strengths. And of course, the need for the US to work with allies and partners. Fred also makes a very important observation about the Chinese side that I think will be part of the debate about this book, which is the need for China and others to commit to the international system, certainly to prevent erosion or even collapse, while recognizing their different perspectives. And that's a very debatable issue today, given some of the trend of Chinese policies, partly reacting to the US, but partly also under Xi Jinping's leadership. My sense is that the rebuilding effort will need to proceed step by step. There's a deep lack of trust. I think one will have to have practical examples of problem solving. One of my ideas is to develop informal cooperation with multilateral institutions. So just to give a small flavor of this, Larry and Fred and I were all part of the G7, G20 world. There's a value to the role the IMF can play in convening these groups. I've suggested the IMF managing director convene the key participants in the SDR, special drawing right, US, EU, China, Japan, the UK, and just have regular quarterly sessions reviewing how they see the macroeconomic conditions, perhaps moving towards some degree of cooperation. And for those of you that still live in the world of markets, let me just suggest, if you have an event like the global financial crisis of 2008, given the breakdown in US-Chinese relations, it's going to be a much more difficult crisis than it was, where China basically cooperated quite closely with the United States. But we could explore other examples. In trade, I think the Biden administration won't do this because it's controlled by protectionists and some progressive logic of penalizing the United States. Is that the process of removing barriers of tariffs could be done with some steps on various disputes, IPR, forced technology transfer. I think China's economic problems will actually create an opportunity to sort of revisit some of these issues. And even cooperation on growth and development. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, contrary to some worries, actually cooperated with the multilateral institutions. As Fred mentioned, notably, it actually has promptly said it wasn't going to be doing any lending in Russia. Frankly, I had the idea that the World Bank could have created we created an infrastructure sort of experimental center in Singapore to try to come up with a deal flow with private capital. That could have worked with the Asian Infrastructure Bank. My point is there's a number of opportunities out there if you come up with practical steps. And one that I'll highlight that I think the Peterson Institute may be involved in just in the next coming months, there's a book coming out of William and Mary called Banking on Beijing. And it's based on a data source from an aid for data system that I had encouraged when I was at the World Bank that produced 15 years of incredible data on Chinese investment and assistance. And without getting into all the details, the bottom line is China's role has been neither hero nor villain. And there's a lot of lessons that could be useful for African states, China, and the multilaterals. But you have to have a context in which people try to work on these problems. Similarly with climate and carbon and biological security. Now, Fred pushes further. I have to say, I think there's a low likelihood that some of his structural ideas are going to be accepted by either side. But I think he performs a very valuable role by considering the dangers of failing to rebuild. So as a policymaker, it's always important to think, if not this, then what? And sort of what will be the likely course of events. And I'll close with this other idea from history, since Fred dates back to this period. This is the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. Stephanie may not know this. I wrote a piece for her news service, Bloomberg, where I did a little historical comparison and said what was striking about the Shanghai Communique was its unusual diplomatic nature, where the United States and China identified their disagreements as opposed to the banal sort of areas of agreement. Sorry, that's my young kitten. But then also noted the areas of cooperation. And as Kissinger said, it was a map for working going forward. So perhaps some combination of revisiting what the United States managed to do with a China that was a revolutionary enemy 50 years ago, and Fred's idea might create a model for return. Today, the political environment is not right, but at some point, I hope it will be.
Thank you. And I should encourage people, actually, we already have some questions, some very good ones, but if you're listening and you want to contribute to questions, just use the Q&A function within the Zoom. And actually, if other speakers, if any of the three speakers want to interject and they want to be very polite, they could raise their hand. But Larry Summers. Gotta take yourself off mute.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is good to be here to celebrate Fred's book and also to be with Bob. This book is vintage, Fred, ebullient, confident, data-laden, strategic, with catchy policy proposal, minimizing of obstacles to his vision, but possessed of a wonderful concreteness. I learned much from reading it, and it will only further contribute to Fred's well-deserved reputation as the doyen. I thought that was a wonderful phrase. I hope someday, as I get older, I can be called a doyen of something. So it's a real privilege to be here with Fred. To say all of those things about Fred is not to say, however, that he's always right. And in my remarks, I may suggest some limitations. Two observations first about the broad framework here. One is there is now a vast contest underway in which Fred is a participant to identify a strategy that is neither a continuation of the engagement strategy of the 1970 to 2015 period, nor a reversion to the Cold War. And everyone, not everyone, but a vast sensible center derives energy for whatever it is advocating by rejecting those two alternatives. And then the question is what you're going to put in your place. And Fred's CCC policy is, whatever it is, conditional, what is it, Fred?
Conditional competitive cooperation.
Conditional competitive cooperation is but the latest in that sweepstakes. I'm not sure that that's going to be the best acronym of Fred's career, but that's what this is all about. Second observation, it is the American way of strategy. And I think Fred somewhat falls victim to this, that I think of strategy as having three elements. First, a definition of what you want. Second, a consideration of what leverage you have to achieve what you want. And third, a description of on what areas you're prepared to compromise and do things you don't want and make concessions in order to get what you want. And it is the American way of strategy, and even more the American think tank way of strategy, to put overwhelming emphasis on the first of those rather than the second and the third. If we could be in a CCC regime with China, that would be wonderful. But these kinds of exercises tend to remind me of a football practice where the varsity offense practices against the second team defense and the plays work really well. But the problem is that when the other side is highly present, it gets substantially more difficult. And I'm not sure China wants to decide to de-link economics and politics. I'm not sure China wants to decide to cooperate with us in the areas that we think are most important to cooperate. I'm not sure China wants to delimit competition to the spheres that we think are safe. So in general, I would urge consideration of how this will work when there's another party that has to be engaged with. I think that I slightly resisted the rather idealistic notion and constant pay-ons to American economic leadership here. I am all for American being strong and all of that. But I think that I prefer to think of American economic leadership as a means to an end, rather than as an end unto itself. And I think the rest of the world has that view even more strongly. I'm not sure that the best way to be an indispensable nation is to proclaim yourself to be an indispensable nation. And a similar idea applies with respect to American economic leadership. I also think, this is a more difficult point, I teach a course on globalization. And every year I teach the glorious history of the foundings of Bretton Woods and all of that. And in the 10 years I have taught it, I think I know more about it now than I did at the beginning. And I place a little bit less emphasis on idealism today. And I place a little bit more emphasis on the common need to be strong in the face of the Soviet Union. And I suspect that as I study it more, I will continue to evolve in that direction. And that raises a question about the feasibility of the more idealistic visions unconnected to a focus on political opposition vis-a-vis China. And I think that thinking about this question requires recognizing that the best way to spur domestic action is to have a serious foreign threat to focus on. But the best way to exacerbate a serious foreign threat is to focus on conflict. And the art of statesmanship is to balance those two objectives. When the reality was the Soviet Union, it was clear how you balance those objectives, and we got the interstate highway system, we got a vast national commitment to science and all of that. I think it is rather more difficult now. I was surprised that neither Fred nor Bob emphasized what strikes me as being a substantial possibility. And that is that American views of the Chinese economy today are like American views of the Soviet economy in 1960 or American views of the Japanese economy in 1990. There is, it seems to me, a reading of history, and I am not enough of a historian to know whether this is, to have any confident view as to whether this is right, but I would fight with anyone who dismissed it as ridiculous. That the declaration of a missile gap, that the substantial mobilization by the United States in the early Kennedy years was creating of paranoia in the Soviet Union that led to adventurism in Berlin, and much more importantly, adventurism in Cuba, and helped to bring the world to the most dangerous point that it has been. So I think the concern about provoking the insecure needs to loom large in our thinking with respect to China. And I would record the view that demography, COVID, major problems in finding the next aggregate demand source, large financial strains, cause me to think that there is a substantial risk that China will be the third great American economic overestimation. I do not think policy can be based on the premise that that view is correct, but I think policy needs to plan very much for that kind of scenario. I think that finally there is a need to think about setting aspirations lower. Fred is the ultimate proponent of the bicycle theory in everything. Fred believes that if you're not going forward with a lot of new initiatives, it's almost certain that you're going to go backwards. But in fact, lots of times, what you need to do is not screw things up and make them worse. And the Hippocratic Oath becomes relevant for policy. I am struck on the one hand by the range of gratuitous truculence in which the United States seems to be engaged on Taiwan and other things. And am struck on the other hand, and I think that anyone concerned with China needs to internalize this much more heavily, that there have been, I believe, 38 meetings between President Putin and Premier Xi. I am reasonably confident in stating that there has been no 10-year period when any American president has had 38, any set of American presidents have had 38 meetings with any foreign leader or sequence of foreign leaders of any country. This seems to me to be an enormous thing with which we need to reckon much more at the center of our strategic thinking with China. Even as I was struck, and I suspect that someone better informed than I could cite a dozen examples of this kind, by the article I read this morning about the massive Chinese presence in Panama, in all kinds of enterprises very near and very close to a canal that is not unimportant to US strategic interests. And so thinking about mutual non-provocation and strategic reassurance seems to me a less lofty but more feasible goal for us as we think about the United States and China. It is far easier to be a discussant and make some pertinent and hopefully relevant observations than it is to synthesize a strategy. And so let me conclude by just observing that while I'm not in complete agreement with Fred, I am complete and total in my admiration for what he has attempted here. And I believe everyone concerned with this subject needs to very seriously consider his ideas.
Thank you, Larry and Bob Zoellick. I think I'm conscious of the time, and I'm also looking at a array of rather good questions. So obviously, Fred, you should get to respond to that, but I just wonder whether it's worth trying to encapsulate a little bit of what's been said, but also what's coming through on the questions in order to just make your response also responsive to some of those questions. So I think there's obviously, running through both sets of comments, but probably more so Larry's, a belief that though conditional competitive cooperation is undoubtedly appealing. It's not necessarily plausible or even remotely possible in a world where both sides seem to have decisively chosen already something much less collaborative. I think that's running through everyone's comments. And I think related to that, I guess, going back to what Larry said at the start, there's a sort of nagging question of whether being a conditional competitive collaborator is sufficiently different from being a responsible stakeholder, for example, to be, is there enough of a distinction between this strategy and that past strategy, which I think many people feel is not remotely workable now? Is it different enough to be a match to for the situation we face, where the level of mutual mistrust is really quite significant? And just to follow on from that and to capture the spirit of some of the questions, we have a number of people who are asking about what conditions you would impose, and what evidence. Bill Bicallis is asking what kind of economic and trade policy changes should the US demand from China, and what evidence is there that China is prepared to make any meaningful concessions? That's one question from him. And then there's actually a later question that somebody has asked, asking whether the US would be willing to accept conditionality from China, which of course would be a relevant question for China to ask. And finally, I would just say, because the example I had in my head and I was quite struck by at the time, when you talk about, or when Bob talks about the quite reasonable perception that China might have, or belief might have, that the US simply wants to slow China down and prevent it from growing and succeeding, it has become commonplace, not just in the Trump administration, but in the Biden administration, for senior cabinet members to state as a matter of fact that we really want to slow, this is a quote from Gina Raimondo, but it could be from several others. If we really want to slow down China's rate of innovation, we need to work with Europe. We have to work with our European allies to deny China the most advanced technology so they can't catch up in critical areas like semiconductors. Those remarks weren't even really picked up. No one thought that was surprising that they would just bluntly say that. So I think if we could, in your response, I think it would be worth trying to capture how you see that conditionality working in practice. And then that might answer some of the more general question about whether it is really plausible in the current environment.
Well, thank you very much for putting those questions together so nicely. I want to start by thanking both Bob and Larry for their very helpful and supportive comments. It's been great to work with both of them very closely over a long time, and I appreciate their participation in this event and helping me so much in so many ways over the years. Stephanie, let me perhaps start with the last questions you raised coming off the viewers, because those are the tough ones. Would China play and would the US play? I put a lot of weight, as I did in my remarks today, on China's core interest, and I use that term deliberately given Chinese terminology, their core interest in an open global economic system. That has been absolutely essential to their development miracle. Yes, they will be giving more focus on domestic demand going forward, I suspect, but they're still going to be heavily integrated in the world. It will be essential for them, and therefore they have a cardinal interest in avoiding its blowing up or even significantly declining. The trade war with the US has hurt them some. As I said, they've overcome it, but if by some magic the US could get the whole world to approach China in that way, it would be hugely, hugely critical for them. And that's why I think they are playing ball substantively, not rhetorically, but substantively, over Ukraine, and why they will avoid doing things that will damage the system and therefore their own interests. Now, that's a judgment on China's relative interests and the weight it puts on different objectives, but I do think that that will be the case. I noticed what happened on a topic that I studied very closely, and in fact was out front in raising alarms, as Larry knows, back almost 20 years ago, currency manipulation. The Chinese did enormous damage to the US and the world economy through their currency manipulation. They never admitted fault. They never backed off because of the foreign pressure. But over time, they responded to the foreign pressure and stopped the practice. Now, will they do the same on the trade and investment issues? I don't know, but that to me is an encouraging precedent on an issue where I was maybe the leading hawk of all. On the US side, there clearly will have to be a change in mindset. As you said, as several now said, the Chinese do think the US is trying to hold them down. And as long as that's the case, there's probably not much prospect for getting together. The US will have to recognize, and that was my point number one, the US will have to recognize that China has now become a peer, at least in economic terms, that requires us to work with them, whether we like it or not. And that means we will have to make some compromises. Now, both Bob and Larry said, we'll have to make some compromises we don't want to make. Bob said we need some specific examples where we can move ahead. And I think there are such on offer. We missed the big one. When the Chinese invited us to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank right off the start, if we had had the proper mindset, as I recommended to the White House at the time, we would have joined. We would have shocked the Chinese by accepting their invitation. Joined, worked with them, it all would have worked out fine. Right now, Bob made a very cogent proposal to get China and the US and a few others together in the IMF, the reserve currency countries, to talk as a collegiate group. I suggested ending the trade war. That would be fully reciprocal. US exporters would love it. The US farm community would particularly love it. There would be strong support for that idea. There is a lot of consensus in Washington on the need to respond to the China challenge, take on China, be tough. But there is no consensus as to how to do that. Larry's quite right. We're all looking for an intermediate course. And I think the one I've laid out is at least a reasonable contender to win that horse race.
Just very quickly on that, because that's a good example of just almost one word answers. But Bob and Larry, what do you think about just the infrastructure bank as one example of a place where we could find some common ground economically?
I'm sorry, what do I think about what?
The Asian, whether there was a mistake, as Fred is suggesting, not to join the Asian Infrastructure Bank.
And join it now. And join it now.
Look, it was worse than a mistake. I mean, it was a mistake not to join, and it was an egregious mistake to try and fail to get our European allies to not join, in the sense that it was both hostile to China and a demonstration of fecklessness. So I would say it was a low point of the second-term Obama administration's international economic diplomacy. I think, and I agree that bank, it seems to me, has been singularly constructive relative to any reasonable expectation in its collaboration with the traditional MDBs and in its pursuit of values, as illustrated most recently by stopping lending to Russia. I don't think it's politically planetary that the U.S. Congress is going to make a commitment of funds to that bank. And I think the United States needs to be careful about making international commitments that it in the end will not be able to meet. And I think one of the places where I have tended to disagree with you over the years is in your enthusiasm for international economic diplomacy, getting us onto the tips of our skis relative to what can happen domestically. To revisit a past episode, I thought the idea of a bilateral investment treaty with China in the political climate of 2016 was ludicrous. And that there was a failure of the domestic adults to supervise the eager international diplomats that led to gratuitous raising of expectations and embarrassment. So I agree with you, but I don't think this is the moment for the US to join. And I think if somebody mounted an attempt, there'd be a significant risk that the idea of joining would be discredited for a decade rather than revisitable in several years.
So Stephanie, could I just take a shot at this, because I want to take it a slightly different angle that it may also address some of the other questions I've seen. I don't think it would have been politically possible to get congressional support during the Obama administration, but the mistake was then opposing it. So I touched on this briefly. With a little creativity, the World Bank was creating a special infrastructure center in Singapore to try to draw in private capital. We got money from the Singaporeans. We're trying to, in a sense, learn what's the right way to use public capital, whether at the equity level, mezzanine, so on and so forth. It would have been natural to embrace the AIIB if it followed good governance and standards and connect it with an existing institution. Now, again, to give you some, because some of the questions are, will China ever cooperate? Jin LeQuinn, who's the head of it, hired a bunch of people that used to work for me at the World Bank. And they were quite sensitive about issues of environmental sustainability, governance, procurement. They actually opened up their procurement to the US, not as a member. So I'm not saying this will always happen, but that's an example of something that could happen. And to take it one step further, I saw one of the questions about intellectual property rights. Look, China created a series of intellectual property rights courts a few years ago, and they started to fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. Okay. Now, will China also have an interest in having intellectual property protection and keeping foreign investment? Yes, it will. Forced technology transfer, prohibited by their WTO accession agreement, but always very hard to get companies to give the evidence because they're afraid of retaliation. So I would probably focus on reducing joint venture requirements. And could you convince the Chinese to try to do this? So this is where some of it's in the trenches, devil in the detail. But part of diplomacy, going back to one of Larry's funny points, Kissinger has this idea of fantasy diplomacy, where the US simply says, do this. And if people don't agree, we'll simply repeat our talking points, speaking louder and more slowly. The reality is, can you find allies within China on some of these items? And part, going back to another point that Larry made, I felt that, ironically, some of the China hawks have less confidence in the United States than I do. I think China is going to face some very difficult days ahead. And as that happens, there will be efforts, as there have been in the past in China, to reassess its position. And at that point, we have to decide, do we want to have a dialogue with China to try to resolve some of these issues, which will involve integration, or to try to separate? And that's where the strategic choice that Fred is trying to set out is an important one, even if I tend to agree with Larry. I think he stretches to what could be accomplished at this point.
Fred, you're going to get the last word. We've gone over, but I think we're sort of getting to a point where it's part of this is about how you see, if we all agree that your strategy is not implementable in the current environment and that quite a big mind shift would be required, is your path to that a piecemeal one, or the most realistic path, that one could sort of build little islands of this kind of CCC, which gradually take us to a new world? Or do you have some, give some credence to those who would look at Russia, the situation with Russia and Ukraine, look at how the entire relationship with China has gone over the last 20 years and say, you know what, economics and politics can't be separated. And the institutions we've tried to create, thinking we could just separate the economics, are not realistic?
No, I would certainly go piecemeal where opportunities arose. Bob and Larry both stressed There's great mistrust between the US and China. If you could get a few wins, it would be very positive. I've suggested one on the trade front. I've been quite encouraged, actually, that just in the last couple of weeks, there have been some noises out of the Biden administration talking about possible changes in the things they inherited from Trump. Those might represent a start. If the Chinese respond to those signals, I think we might start down the path. One final point. Larry made a very important point at the end of his remarks that China could go the way of the Soviet Union or Japan in terms of not fulfilling expectations of forever growth. There's one big difference. China is already there. What my analysis tried to show is that China has already achieved rough equivalence with the United States in terms of economic power. So even if their growth slowed way down, Larry himself in the past has said, well, they'll probably slow down to 3 or 4%. Even if they slowed more than that, they are already there. The Soviet Union was nowhere near the US. Japan was not within shouting distance of the US. China is there. It's already a roughly equivalent power. I think we're going to have to deal with it unless it went into some almost unimaginable reverse course and blew up. So I think my proposals need to be considered, even if one is more pessimistic about their growth rate going forward.
Okay, I've broken the fundamental rule of Peterson Institute of not keeping to time, but those watching will see why I wasn't able to keep to time. And I thank you, Fred, for the book and for the explanation, and everyone who's joined the call, and of course to Bob Zoellick and Larry Summers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Fred, Larry.
Thank you all.